Well, hey, what's up, buddy?
Hey, I'm good. What's up with you?
Nothing much.
All right, so I want to talk about socialism. I hear you have some thoughts about that.
A little bit, sure. Where do you want to start?
Sure. So I guess my understanding, I haven't watched everything, is that you think that the idea of having an economy with like workers' control of businesses would be impractical. Like if we say that like what socialism could be would be a society where maybe like some key sectors of the economy are nationalized, but like if you still have a private sector, we try to make it one that's dominated by workers' cooperatives. And is your view, as I understand it, that like that wouldn't work, or that would lead to really bad consequences, something like that?
I'm not entirely sure if it would work or not. I don't really have anything against co-ops. It seems like there are some co-ops that are pretty successful. I guess I just don't like the I don't like the I get like the general feel from lefties that instead of like trying to like modernize our economy and our workforce, the goal is to make it so that everybody can have like a job like at a manufacturing plant or McDonald's and make like $30 an hour, and that just seems like really backwards thinking, I guess. I don't know if that's necessarily related to like a socialism versus capitalism thing, but
Well, it could be related. So, well, I mean, like one way that the two topics could be related is that if you, I mean, might actually run the other way around, right? So, like an argument socialists use sometimes is that under capitalism, if you have new technology, so some of those jobs you're talking about might be eliminated by that technology,
mhm.
then some people just end up losing their jobs and they're kind of desperate until they can find a new job. Whereas if workers were controlling the businesses, then once those some of the labor that had to be done by humans is automated away, then maybe the necessary grunt work that still had to be done, people could just vote themselves fewer hours, and they could and nobody would like have to lose economically because of that.
Well, how do you really think that like if workers, let's say for instance you had a manufacturing plant and you can make this
Hmm.
plant, like 10,000 times more efficient. Do you really feel like people would
Okay.
vote away their jobs?
Well, the reason that people wouldn't vote away their jobs under the system we have right now is that like if people didn't have like if you didn't work, then you don't have a paycheck, right? So if we had automation so it could get rid of most of the work that needed to be done by humans. So let's say that like there were, what used to be done by, four people could now be done by one person. Well, one way that you could handle that is to just lay off the three people and have one person do as much as they did before. But if the workers were controlling the company, then they could just say, "Hey, why don't we each just work 2 hours instead of the 8 hours that we used to?" And since we're getting just as much produced, then we could all still earn what we did before.
So then instead of those people moving into working other jobs that could be worked in the economy, they still would make the same amount of money just working 25% of the time?
I mean, if that was I mean, ideally, yeah. I mean, if they have and of course, people that might also free them up to pursue other interests. If you only had to, work a much shorter amount of time, then, maybe you'd be able to go back to school,
Do you think
pursue other
is
projects.
it realistic that our economy could thrive in a global economy when all of our workers are working like 1 or 2 hours a day because they don't get other jobs because some parts of their previous jobs had been automated?
So I guess I'm not quite sure I'm following the question. So if it's the idea that because we would it would be just as productive as it was before, right? As many widgets are being produced at the widget factory as they were being produced before that, but because it takes less human labor to do that, that in itself doesn't seem like, even if the United States was just an island of socialism, which by the way I don't really think would happen. I think that the United States, being probably one of the political cultures in the world that's most hostile to socialism, I have a hard time imagining the United States becoming socialist unless like everywhere else was first.
Yeah, sure,
But
but I'm just imagining like in our entire economy, all of these
mm-hmm,
jobs that end up getting automated. So like in the ideal capitalist world,
mm-hmm.
the market would send a signal that these sorts of jobs aren't needed anymore, and then people would fill in other jobs or would acquire higher education to work different types of jobs to maintain that automated system. But basically becoming a service economy, right? As our economy has kind of moved into that direction. I'm just. Yeah, but then it seems like the alternative in your world is that in a socialist economy, these workers would never do that because somehow all of the like McDonald's automates all the jobs away, manufacturing plants automates all the jobs away, and then all the workers say, "Oh, well, we'll just work 2 hours a week instead then, and that'll be okay." That's
Well, I mean, one thing that that scenario assumes is that nobody has any other aspirations for what they'd like to do with their lives besides working at McDonald's. You know, if they had, could be that once their time is freed up, then people would pursue all sorts of, creative endeavors that might actually end up helping the economy a lot more.
Do you think it's realistic, though, that all of the spots in our economy that need to be filled would be filled if we just let people kind of like be guided by what they want to do and we ignore like all of the market signals for jobs that might be needed?
I'm not sure that for ignoring all the market signals for jobs, for jobs that might be needed, because what we're talking about are people who, had been working, at McDonald's, say, or, whatever the future socialist equivalent is of McDonald's. And then some of the, we get a automatic burger flipping machine. And so some of those jobs are automated away. So if they're going to continue to work at that company, then everybody might have to work fewer hours. But like if there's something that like needs to be done to like because you're talking about going into like service jobs, and I kind of try to envision a society where there were fewer service jobs, and that doesn't necessarily seem like a disaster.
Well, in the
So
U.S., it seems like that's the direction that our economy's been headed in for quite a while, for like the last like 40, 50 years, right? Is moving more towards a service economy.
okay, but I'm wondering like if there were let's because you seem to be talking about new avenues for for economic growth that might open up.
Mm-hmm.
And fair enough. Maybe if you didn't have as much economic pressure for people to go into those as you did before, because people aren't desperate because they're between jobs, maybe some of those new sectors that would have opened up otherwise open up more slowly. But I'm not sure that that's an unambiguously bad thing, especially when you start to think about the ecological effects of constant growth for the sake of growth.
Well, I mean, you say constant growth for the sake of growth, but if other countries are growing under more aggressive, like market-based patterns, and then we have a ton of companies like paying people to not work, I don't know. It just seems like that's not like a healthy, positive direction to move, I guess, into the future. Like, say, for instance, say McDonald's starts to automate a whole bunch of things, and then those workers are looking for other types of work, and that might mean that other businesses could open up because now there's more labor available. That just would never happen, right? Because people would continue to work for 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week at McDonald's doing nothing.
Yeah, so the premise of the question was about international competition,
Mm-hmm.
and this does go back to the point about whether we're envisioning the United States as an island of socialism in a still capitalist world. And I suggested earlier that I wouldn't expect it to happen that way. Um, but even beyond that, of course, there are still going to be all the time new, like just let's say people are worker owners of McDonald's, and so maybe more people get to keep their jobs at McDonald's because they're working fewer hours than happened before. Then I'm not. That doesn't mean that there's nobody who would be working in new sectors. That they have more people turn 18 every day. It might mean that there are fewer. And if we are imagining that that the United States is the only island of socialism in the world, then I can understand the concern a little bit more. But if we're imagining a global socialist world, then we might just have a slower global growth rate, which might actually be a lot better for the planet.
So I definitely don't disagree with you there, but I mean, I don't know how to engage with that idea. Like, socialism could work in the United States if every negative outcome that I'm perceiving, a lot of my negative outcomes are going to be related to losing in global markets. If
Hmm.
every single country became socialist, then we would all be kind of roped in together on these same socialist policies. But I mean, I don't know how to engage with that. Like,
Okay,
obviously
okay.
that's fantastical, right? Like,
Well, I mean, I think it's more fantastical to think that you get socialism in the United States before it became the dominant global system, given that in a lot of other countries throughout the world, you're starting off with much more prior consciousness about socialism. People, the political spectrum starts out much further to the left in many other places.
Hmm.
Certainly, the idea of like cooperatives, like there are European countries that already have bigger cooperative sectors than we have. The United States, last time I checked, has something like less than a 7% rate of unionization, even in the private sector.
Hmm.
So I would argue that it's more unrealistic to think that the United States would get there first. But I guess I had thought that you also had, beyond the sort of international competition concerns, you had some kind of innate concerns about the about whether, like, worker self management could really work effectively. Like, if like, as if I know, I think one of the previous people that you discussed with had kind of dropped a bunch of statistics about how workers cooperatives in many ways are at least as productive as traditional businesses. But I got the impression that you were still skeptical at that point, because I think your perspective was kind of, well, if these are so great, right? If they're so productive, if they're so efficient,
Hmm.
then, like, why don't they dominate the economy already? I mean, is that kind of your concern?
Yeah, well, I'd be wondering. So you'd either have to demonstrate that there's some capitalist, I don't want to say conspiracy in a derogatory way, but that there's some like institutional barrier to entry for co-op stuff that makes it hard for them to start, in order to persuade me more. And then
Yeah.
also for the record, I don't
Yeah.
have like I'm not like deeply rooted in my position that I like hate
Mm-hmm.
co-ops. Like if co-ops work, and like honestly, the idea of a co-op working, like the fact that you have partial ownership in a company, that feels good to me. That seems like a good thing. Although I don't know, like if you've got a big company, I don't know if owning like 0.001% shares in your company really motivates you that much more to work for it, or if voting on management or whatever would motivate you more. But yeah, I'm not opposed to it if it actually ends up working well in the real world.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So, I guess I was going to say a couple things about that, which are that I think, even without kind of a big capitalist conspiracy,
Hmm.
I think there are some reasons why, like, even like, okay, when you see these articles, hey, workers cooperatives, this study shows or that study shows,
Hmm.
are so productive or efficient. I think, okay, well, why aren't there more of them? I think that probably the main thing there is that, even though the death rate for co-ops isn't doesn't seem to be higher than the death rate for traditional hierarchical businesses, that, in other words, once they're going, they seem to last about as long.
Hmm.
I think the big difference is that the birth rate is a lot lower, and I think that at least one of the reasons that the birth rate is a lot lower, um, is just that structurally, it's a lot easier to get initial capital together for a more traditional business, because you can get investors in it, because you can actually, the investors, instead of just like paying them back, which maybe a workers cooperative could do, you could actually give them a continued share of the ownership of the company going forward.
Well, as
Whereas,
soon as you bring investors in, haven't you kind of lost your
well, no,
purpose?
that's my point, right?
Uh
So
huh.
I think that, like, I think this is one of the reasons why the birth rate of, even though the death rate is about the same, I think the
Hmm.
birth rate is going to be much lower,
Hmm.
because, as you say, as soon as you bring in investors, then you sort of lost the point of the co-op. I think another thing maybe that's a disadvantage of co-ops, is that in an economy that's dominated by traditional hierarchical businesses, a company can very rapidly expand if you as much as possible of the output is spent on expansion, right? So, like,
Hmm.
you pay workers very little, maybe early on. You spend a lot of time expanding, and it's much harder, I think, understandably, to sell people on kind of voting to live in poverty for the sake of the expansion of the business. So I think, again, these are both ways that, I think, as far as the starter capital, I think this is one of the reasons why most socialists think that you need to have some kind of government intervention to move towards a system based on this. Like, for
Hmm.
example, Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party in the UK, has a proposal that, to expand the cooperative sector, that every time a company is going to go out of business or leave the country, or change ownership, then they'd get a right of first refusal if the workers could get together the money to buy it out, to run it as a co-op, and combine that with government loans. We could imagine something even more ambitious, like you combine it with maybe nationalizing banks, so you could have preferential loans to co-ops.
Hmm.
But I think the second factor does again mean that probably in a co-op dominated economy, because people aren't going to have the same kind of incentives to do that kind of rapid expansion because that the owners of more traditional companies might have. I
If
think that does mean that you probably are going to have slower economic growth. I think that's true.
so, wouldn't you
I
have
think
to like if you were to say if you were to go with this co-op model, then wouldn't you basically have
yeah.
to demand that the entire economy switch to co-ops only? You'd have to ban the privatization of any business. Like private property would have to be essentially abolished, and capital would all have to be turned over to workers, right? Because like in this kind of economy, like say we take that McDonald's example, right? The capitalist run institution is going to fire all the workers that don't need to work there anymore. The co-op one is going to keep those workers hired and just have them work less. It seems like the capitalist one will always be more efficient and have lower prices and drive the other ones out of business, no?
Well, the empirical evidence doesn't seem to suggest that, right? That like even though the birth rate is lower, the death rate seems to be about the same. So I mean, I could see,
Well, like,
you
so
know,
I feel like that's not 100% fair. There might be like some industries that maybe
mhm.
co-ops work better in than other industries, but to my knowledge, at least in the United States, there aren't like these massive successful, like it's not a big part of the economy, right? Like these are like a pretty minor feature of the economy. For the most part, it seems like privately ran businesses and like franchise businesses, which is also like private capital, seem to do better at competing in the market than co-ops do.
Yeah. So again, I think that statistically, they tend to last about as long as you started. But maybe
Hmm.
your idea is that like that in the industries where they'd be most likely to be outcompeted the fastest, they just don't start in the first place.
Yeah, something like that maybe. That's like a
Yeah.
cart before the horse. I could be wrong on that though, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested in seeing more data about that. I mean, it's hard to kind of speculate a priori, but
Hmm.
I would. I would say that that long term, I would like an economy that was, thoroughly dominated by cooperatives, and that you could have like I think there are a lot of ways that you could get there. Like I said, thinking about nationalized banking, preferential loans, this kind of right of first refusal thing.
I feel
Uh,
like when you start getting into like preferential loans, well, so I guess so when we start talking about preferential loans, we've basically conceded that a co-op will never be as efficient as like a capitalist ran thing, right?
well, it could be that it's less efficient, but that like in certain respects it might be less efficient. But
Hmm.
I'm not sure that that's the whole game, right? Like by kind of like not that I'm saying these things are remotely morally analogous, but
Hmm.
like thinking about like slave plantations before the Civil War, there's probably a good reason why it wasn't the case that you could have just ended slavery by getting like free labor cotton farms to outcompete slave plantations, right? That is,
Well, but isn't that my history is really bad? So you can make shit up and I'll lose the argument. But okay, so I'm just fully admitting it. But isn't that kind of what happened with slavery? Like, wasn't it the industrialized North that was pushing for it as opposed to the agricultural South because they were more economically willing to like? So wasn't it kind of like an economic argument there, even for slavery?
Well, I mean, of course, the industrialized North was in favor of abolishing slavery because it was in their interest to have people, be like. I think that, their economic system, was favored by free labor, so like they were the ones who were pushing it. But the actual abolition of slavery, of course, had to take place through, force, right?
Sure, yeah.
The Union
Well,
Army coming in and
Civil War, yeah,
right, the Civil War, right?
yeah.
Exactly.
I know that one. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of our most frequently reenacted wars. So yeah, I would say that again, it's not that even that even though there is that was the case that you still like the northern industrial economy might have gradually been getting stronger and better, etc. But at the very least, I mean, maybe it would have eventually happened, maybe not, but it doesn't seem like, certainly on any kind of reasonable time scale, you could have just outcompeted the southern slaveholders, because, and one likely reason for that is that those cotton plantations had some built-in advantages, because they could because you didn't have to pay people wages, and like, that's more efficient in some ways. But I think that, like, the question, if we're having this conversation before the abolition of slavery, wouldn't be like, okay, is slavery more efficient in certain respects than free labor? Fair enough, it probably is going to be more efficient in some respects. The question is free labor efficient enough that we would be okay if we transitioned over to
I understand what you're saying, right? So, like, to use a hyperbolic example, like, if we could power the economy, like, if an efficient source of energy was like sacrificing children in order to run like power plants, it wouldn't be a good argument for me to say, well, look, I mean, it's really efficient, right? You're saying that there's a moral wrong that's been committed there that kind of like supersedes the efficiency argument, basically, right?
Yeah, or that, like, at the very least, it would be better, it would be more desirable in those ways if people could have this kind of control over their day-to-day lives, that that kind of autonomy, that would be better.
Yeah, and
so the efficiency would have to be a lot to outweigh that. I think that would be my perspective.
Sure, and I understand that. I guess, like, my contention then is, I would say that, like, I don't think it's as massively morally wrong as some people present it, that like the way that we compete for jobs right now and the way the markets function now, or at least not to the level where it would be like analogous to like slavery, where I would consider like employment period to be a moral wrong. Like, some lefties seem to, right? So I don't know how people feel this way. Like, I hear like labor is exploitation. Some people say exploitation is just a descriptive term. It doesn't necessarily mean it's morally wrong. But then I hear other people say that, like, well, the fact that a manager can make any money or an owner can make any money off their labor is morally wrong. So I don't know if they think it's all kind of the same. But like, I would argue that it's probably not like that huge of a moral wrong, as long as other goods are being provided for in society. My main worry is just back to that global market thing. Like, it seems like
Sure, right. No, I get that. So, I mean, I would say on the question of whether it's wrong in itself, and I think you're right. I think that sometimes socialists, we're probably a little bit ambiguous about that, because yes, there's a descriptive technical meaning to the way that we use the word exploitation, but clearly
people morally load it, yeah.
Clearly the fact that we're using the word exploitation to describe that thing means we don't like it, right? And I think that's fair enough. I think that the issue is not like, okay, is it as bad as slavery or child sacrifice? Clearly not, right? But like, I think the issue is whether there's something that's like fundamentally unfair about the idea that most people realistically have no choice but to go to work for somebody who owns a company, because that's like, you could start your own business, but like,
that's going to be a small fraction.
Capital, most of them fail. There are only so many lifeboats out of this situation, and most of them sink.
Do you really think so? Like, here's another problem that I have. Is it? Or well, go ahead, finish.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say real quick. I think that the worry is that there's something a little bit unfair about the idea that most people have to do that. Some people, sometimes because of skill, right? Sometimes because of innovation, but most often, at least to a very great extent, because of luck in terms of
I'm a hardline determinist. Okay, I'm not going to sit here and tell you the story that like, oh, anybody can become a blah blah blah. That's absolutely fucking asinine. Do you really think so? Another thing that I get into the weeds a lot with a lot of socialists is it feels like a lot of their arguments are weighed down by things that aren't necessarily tied to any economic system. So, for instance, what you just said, it kind of sucks that you're forced to like sell your labor to another person, and your whole life is kind of shit because of that, and the chance of you becoming a capitalist are really slim, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Would we necessarily feel the same way if we provided more things to like the lowest level people in our society? So like, for instance, like places like Sweden or Norway where education is free, or sometimes you get paid to go to school, or you have like free healthcare. Is it really that bad in a country like this that like you have to be a laborer if there are like these much larger social safety nets and you have like much more opportunity to do things that like give you pleasure or enjoyment in life?
I think it's certainly not as bad as it is here. I think that the kinds of reforms that you have in those Nordic social democracies are very good, and they'd be a massive step in the right direction. I think that it's still okay. So I think that I would say that even in the best case scenario, like not even like Sweden now, but like Sweden in the 70s, maybe at the kind of height of that welfare state that they had, then like even then, I do think that there is something to be said for the desirability of being able to control, have more control and more say in where you spend most of your day-to-day life. But I'd also say beyond that, because that might seem like a little bit like, okay, sure, even if you can see the point, you might still think, yeah, but I'm not going to get that excited about that. But I think another point, Bhaskar Sankara just came out with a book called The Socialist Manifesto that he makes in there, is that there are a lot of cases of countries that have passed reforms like that have and sure, fair enough, they've brought about tremendous benefit to ordinary people when they have, but oftentimes since then those do get rolled back because because the people who own businesses, that class of society is still kind of in its position of economic power, and it could always use that economic power when it sort of thinks that it can politically get away with it to start rolling those back. So one reason to think that even something as advanced as Sweden in the 70s, and I don't want to look, I think that those Nordic social democracies, those are probably about as best as we've done in human history, right? I don't want to bash them, but I think that even just for the sake of preserving what's already been won, that alone gives you a reason to want to change the structure of society so that those gains aren't vulnerable to being rolled back in the future.
I don't know. I guess I understand, like it's easy to point out like difficulties in the current systems, and I understand, but like it feels like it's a much better solution is to say like, oh, like we should find a way to codify like certain reforms, like either through like big laws or something like that, as opposed to saying like we literally like need to have like a global socialist government. Like that just seems like so unrealistic to me that like I don't really know how to right like.
Yeah, so I mean, anything that's very different from what we've had just gonna seem unrealistic. I would also say that you don't necessarily even need a global socialist government. I mean, I think you probably do need, like in certain respects, I think even just to like solve climate change, you might need a lot more global integration of governments. But like, I think you could even just have, if the United States, like let's say the United States, China, and the European Union all adopted this kind of like radical democratic socialism, that alone might be hard enough to imagine, but like that would mean that like the sort of main economic blocks of the global economy were in place, and so it wouldn't be the situation that you just sort of have the United States as like the only socialist country, and we'd have to worry the same way that if we only had one country with free labor and everywhere else used slave labor, that that their cotton production would run us out of the market. That we wouldn't have to think, well, the United States is the only socialist bastion of socialism in the world, and we have to and we're going to be decimated in this global global conflict with the capitalist countries.
What's like moving forward then? So like, what is the realistic way forward then for something like this?
Yeah, so I think that you have to start out with social democracy. I mean, I think that you're not going to get from less than 7% private sector unionization to an economy based on workers' control without a lot of baby steps along the way. So I would say, like in the United States, like Bernie Sanders, all that stuff. That's the immediate way forward, and I would be even more excited about that if it started to. He does sometimes talk about cooperatives, but I would be even more excited by that if like he did emphasize that more. That those sorts of Jeremy Corbyn style proposals to at least boost and expand the cooperative sector of the economy, and then maybe if we work on that for long enough, then like the sort of possibilities for more radical change might open up.
I mean, yeah, I don't disagree with that. Like, I like that idea. Like moving forward, like if we had transitioned fully to like a social democracy, like if we were on the level of like Sweden or Norway, and then somebody started talking about how well we need to move towards like more co-ops or the government banks or whatever that give loans, whatever. I think I'd be a little warmer to it. But just like the idea of like screeching right now about like global socialist governments, it just seems like so far out of the real of anything that there are like people that have problems like today in our economy. Like there are people suffering today, and the kinds of changes that people are advocating for are like generations away, if they could ever even happen.
Yeah, I mean, what I struggle with is that I agree with you. I think that it's going to be a very long transition. I think that we're nowhere near getting there right now, right? I think that you are probably right about the time scale. Although the reason that maybe I am a little bit more sympathetic to the Screechers is that I also think that I'm very skeptical, given the incentives that exist in the kind of economic system that we have right now, about our ability to avoid environmental catastrophe within that system.
Sure, but like
Though,
socialism, like co-ops or whatever, none of that has anything to do with the environment either, though, right? Like there's no reason to think that like a co-op or whatever would do anything more to address environmental issues than a free market.
maybe not. Like here's why I think that it might help. I think that if you have large numbers of people, who are directly affected, oftentimes by these, by pollution, for example, by these questions, who are in a position to have democratic input into decision making, especially. I mean, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but
Yeah, but like
I think that there's an estimate that there's some really small number of companies in the world that are directly responsible for some massive chunk of global climate change.
sure.
And so if you have one of those companies, even if it wasn't nationalized, even if it was run as a private cooperative, if you're talking about like many thousands of employees, and they don't necessarily have the sort of huge stake in the existing practices of the company that they would have if they were like major stockholders in a private company. Then I think that I'm much more optimistic. The more democratic input there is into the system and people's ability to say, hey, do we want to be able to expand a little bit faster, or do we want our grandchildren to be able to live on this planet? That I'm much more confident that
You say that now, but like we already have a democracy, and there's already what percentage of Americans that don't even believe that climate change is real. Like these would be the same people in the workplaces voting on whether or not we should do it, right? Like Trump said literally like that climate change is a hoax from China. Like all of the people that voted for him, which were a lot of worker type people, right? The whole Rust Belt that kind of swung for him. These would be the people in charge of voting in their workplaces on whether or not we should do something about climate change. So I mean, I guess I'm not fully sold on the idea, and this is where kind of like I'm very inflammatory on Twitter. I don't know which tweets you read, but like I said multiple times, like workers are dumb or whatever. I don't necessarily mean that like workers are like a class, like a genetically bred to be stupid people or whatever. But I think in general, like people seem to be like pretty clueless about issues. And this isn't just workers. This is like all sorts of different people for a variety of reasons too, right? Whether we don't fund education, whether you're on a lower class and you didn't have time to pay attention to that shit, for whatever reason. That the idea that like the same people that voted for Trump, if they were in charge of co-ops, they would just magically be more aware or more caring about climate issues. I don't know. I find that really, really hard to believe.
Yeah, well, I guess I'd say a couple things about that. One of them is...
or sorry, go ahead.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. Yeah, I was gonna say that that one thing is that I think that implementing the kind of radical left-wing changes that I'm advocating here surely involves convincing a lot more of. I mean, like, unless you convince people to change their minds about a lot of things politically, that's not going to happen. And I don't think that like people's views on climate change, that tends to go along with their views about a lot of other things. And then the only other thing I want to point out was that it's not just that people sort of happen to form these views on their own. that there is a very large and very profitable industry devoted to propagandizing them about it,
I
right?
mean, you
That
say
like
that, but like
the
these.
existing. I mean, how much money does ExxonMobil spend, promoting the idea that this is, this is a myth, that, how much, like, like Fox, like the fact that I think that, like, the fact that people watch Fox News and they come to the conclusion that Fox News is right. I mean, you might be right that that doesn't say anything good about them and their critical thinking skills, but it's also not a coincidence, like, that they're buying into this hokum, but it's not a coincidence that this is the particular brand of hokum they're buying into.
But I mean, like, two things. One, like, in this new economy that we're talking about, is all advertising banned? Because why wouldn't, like, coal mining co-ops do the exact same type of advertising? Like, why wouldn't they even band together to do the exact same type of advertising? Like, I would expect them to, right? Workers run the co-ops and they would want to protect their jobs. Like, even in California, right? Like, apparently there's a lot of labor unions that are upset about the Green New Deal because it threatens a lot of their jobs too, which is self-interested behavior that I would expect labor unions to enact. I don't see this whole pull that they would, like, magically become invested. Or I mean, I guess, how do you respond to that? Or what do you think about stuff like that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a fair concern. I think that there are, like, I think that there are ways that you could try to ameliorate that. Like for example, we were talking about, when you were asking me about ways that we could transition to this over time, and I was saying, well, if you had nationalized banks, then they could, give preferential loans to things on the basis of being workers' cooperatives. You could also have, but one of the, if this wasn't like if this was a matter of public policy to decide like which potential ventures got the starter capital, then one of the things that you could use as like I'm losing the word, but like, as one of the standards that you used, to decide, who got loans and starter capital might be environmental impact. And, I think with public banking,
We're right
making
back
these
at square one, though, then. Because now we have to go back to because how are we going to decide who gets that public loan, the preferential thing? That's going to have to come from voting, and those voting people are going to be the same type of people that voted for Trump, and they're still going to be influenced by advertising from like coal-owned co-ops and whatnot. Again, unless we like ban advertising or we do a regulation there, democratically elected. But then again, we're back at square one where it comes back to the electorate.
Sure. So, I mean, if the concern is that anything that we could do structurally to try to do something about, climate change, would have to be democratically, would have to involve like a majority coalition of the voters under socialism. One thing I'd point out is that the same worry applies to anything that you could do about these problems under capitalism. That,
Oh
like,
no, I agree with you 1,000,000,000%. But that's my argument. My argument is that like all of these problems are totally independent of any economic system. Okay. That there are issues in capitalism that can exacerbate these issues. So for instance, like you said, major oil companies that will lobby Congress, that have like certain studies because they'll commission people to do things for them. Like absolutely, I agree. That's definitely a problem. I just don't see how these problems wouldn't exist also in a socialized system. Like for the exact same things can happen.
So, I think, I think that to the extent that what you're saying is that just switching from capitalism to socialism wouldn't magically make the problem go away. I agree, right? I think that's something that's important for socialists to concede just for the sake of intellectual honesty.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's not a sufficient condition. I think it might be a necessary condition though, and here's why. I think that because any solution to climate change under any system is going to have to involve convincing a majority of the people to take the problem seriously.
Well,
which might be depressing enough, right?
That's like, not necessarily true, though. And I hate to cite him, but like as a capitalist example, right? You've got like a big capitalist like Elon Musk, who is like doing things as a private capital owner in order to like deal with like electric cars, right? I don't know if in a public system, if something like that would have happened, if enough people don't believe in it, right? Maybe somebody like that, never gets the public funding in order to do it. But as a capitalist, he was able to pursue that on his own, right?
Okay, so maybe we have a disagreement about this. I would say that given the kind of incentives that exist, I'm expecting that that we're not going to have a solution to climate change that doesn't involve massive amounts of of government intervention to to curb because like there's so much incentive for people who are profiting from environmentally destructive things
Of
just
course. Those
in the
same
short term.
incentives exist in socialism,
No,
though.
no, no,
Right?
no. I get that, right? So here's my point, though, that if you this is why I think that switching over to socialism isn't going to be sufficient for solving climate change, but I think it's necessary because if we agree that like we're going to need government, massive amounts of government intervention, and we want there to be at least the government, certainly we want to be run democratically, then we need to have a majoritarian coalition behind doing something about climate change to do anything about it either way. So that cuts both ways. But then what I think cuts deeper against capitalism is that under capitalism, so much of the power structure is not up for election, right? That there's even that if the power of a democratic government under capitalism to do anything about climate change is limited by the economic power of the current owners of businesses in a way that I think would be much less true if you didn't have the kinds of concentrations of wealth in particular hands that you have with the system based on private ownership of businesses.
I guess what I guess I just don't understand is that it seems like it's not the size of the companies that's the problem. It's going to be the size of the market. So like in capitalism, you have a few big companies that can basically fund a whole bunch of climate change denialism and stuff like that. But in socialism, I would imagine what these companies would do is these companies, kind of like unions, would all come together in order to use their bargaining power, their leverage on society in the form of paying for advertisements or influencing elections or nominating politicians. That's what they would do. That exact same problem still exists because the exact same incentive structure is there, that climate change or rather like climate related issues are externalities that if they're not accounted for by a market, people are always going to vote in their interest for.
Yeah, so I mean I think that one, of course, unions right now have a lot less political power than private corporations do. And I think there are reasons for that. That if you have if you're going to rely on getting large number, and in fact, actually, I think that just the process, just the sheer number of people, if you're going to rely on getting everybody together to vote on let's do the anti-climate change initiative. Let's put out let's fund with all these co-ops the future socialist equivalent of one of these. Like,
well, it wouldn't be like
Exxon.
that. It wouldn't be that
Okay.
hard of an undertaking. You would have the workers that you vote for, right? That would become the managers or the owners, and then those people would represent the electorate, right? Just because you have like a socialized or democratized workplace doesn't mean it would have to literally be like a direct democracy or a referendum on every issue, right?
No, it wouldn't have to be a referendum on every issue, but I think that something as controversial as this is even now, much less as controversial, if we're imagining this happening any later than a few years from now, it's going to be an even more hot button issue. Something like that, I think, would likely be a major issue in managerial elections, the same way that right now it's a major issue in political elections.
Sure, I don't disagree. I just feel like we're still back at the area where you'd still be relying on the democratic workplace or populace to do something about these issues. That it wouldn't be something that would be structurally fixed. It would still come down to like people voting on these issues the same way that it does now, right? Like,
Sure.
so like here's like the issue, I guess, is like any
Sure.
population of people that would be like socialist and would vote to like fix these problems, they'd vote for their managers, blah 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 blah. This would be the same population that in a capitalist system would hardcore support things like cap and trade and stuff that would allow us to make it so companies are incentivized to fix economic problems. Like there's no like. They'd be like the same type of population. So like if we could do it now, or if we could do it under socialism, we'd be able to do it now.
Yeah, and I guess that last part is where I disagree, and I think partially because stuff like cap and trade in that example, that's like given the scale of the problem, that's such that's such weak sauce, right? I mean, like having essentially, selling permits to engage in certain kinds of environmental destruction, which is what that is. And I think that goes to my argument from earlier that, of course, you need to get together a majority Democratic, you need to get together a majority coalition to do anything about climate change in either system. But once you got together that majority coalition under socialism, there would be a lot more levers of power that were directly under their control than you're going to have under capitalism, where economic enterprises are mostly like little fiefdoms that are controlled separately from that.
Yeah, I mean, like, this is like, I feel like we're gonna run around the circle, I guess. That, like, this is where I always get stuck with like other kind of like really lefty people. Is I'm fully not convinced that in any social system people are gonna vote to make their jobs harder or vote to make their jobs obsolete in an effort to save the environment. Like, the whole point of climate change or the whole point of environmental damage is that we don't really feel the effects immediately. That's why it's like such a negative externality that no companies account for. It's because you can pollute all you want and you generally don't feel the effects immediately. I just can't believe that in a social system people would literally vote away their jobs or vote to make their jobs harder to protect an environment that's not like immediately impacting them.
Well, they wouldn't necessarily have to vote away their jobs. That they have a that like so I so a couple things here. First of all, I think that if we're imagining socialism, the first thing I said about it was that we can picture a society where maybe some key sectors are nationalized, though a lot of the rest is dominated by workers' cooperatives. I think that would fit very naturally with like the idea of the public sector as an employer of last resort, and in a way that is going to be very difficult. Of course, people make those proposals right now as a reform, that you have a federal jobs guarantee, things like that. But like I think one of the reasons that that's going to be a very hard sell under the current system is that if we had a federal jobs guarantee, that would really change the bargaining power of workers as opposed to owners. And so the people who have the most economic power right now are going to push back hard against that. Whereas if we imagine a society where you didn't have that split between workers and owners, then you're not going to have that same kind of incentive, like to push back, against having the public sector as the employer of last resort, which would really weaken this sort of worry that, oh my God, if we eliminate certain kinds of economic activity for the sake of the environment, I'm not going to have a job. So that's one thing. The other thing is that earlier, I was talking about different ways that we could imagine the economy, that, for example, said like, that we could have, vote in a public policy whereby one of the standards by which some businesses got, the starter capital from public banks and others didn't, was environmental impact. And you said, and you were right, your objection at the time was, well, if we did that, then we wouldn't have, in order to do that, right, we need to get the majority of the public, right, to take climate change seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, there's this, but that's a much lower standard than getting the people in the very sectors that are going to be most affected by by doing something about climate change to take it seriously. And so if we can, I think that both having the public sector as employer of last resort would cut down resistance even from people in those sectors, and also that you wouldn't necessarily need a majority of people in those sectors. What you would need is just an overall majority of the population.
Okay, I mean, fuck. Okay, let's try. We'll try like just one like razor simple example. Okay.
Sure.
So,
go for it.
Okay, so we'll keep talking about like climate change. Okay. Let's say that you have a union, or not a union. I'm sorry. Let's say that you have a co-op full of people that are involved in either like gas or coal or oil or something like that. Okay.
Sure.
So it comes time for these people, for the entire economy to say like, hey, we don't like your jobs. They're causing pollution, right? Let's say that 47 or 48% of people believe that. So in a very simple way, like how, or rather like, I just, This is like every single thing you've said so far. I think I agree with like 98% of it. I just don't see how it has anything to do with like socialism versus capitalism. Like I don't see how every single thing almost that you suggested can't be implemented in a capitalist system with the same level of efficiency.
Okay. Well, one example of something that I suggested that would at the very least, to be a pretty dramatic adjustment to capitalism. We could argue about where the line is between reforming capitalism and having socialism.
Mm-hmm.
Would be that instead of the current system where you get starter capital from businesses by attracting investors, who think they're going to get a big return on their investment, that you have a system of taxpayer-funded public banking where it's a public policy issue, which kinds of businesses get the starter capital. Now maybe you could have that.
Okay, wait. So real quick, just so I understand every part of this.
Sure.
So right now, what you're talking about is essentially a planned economy, kind of, right?
Yeah, to a great extent, not a not like 5-year plan level.
Okay, sure. So now we're away from capitalism, very much so, right? So now we're in a planned economy. So I acknowledge that this can't happen under capitalism. So now we have a planned economy where the government is choosing which banks, or I'm sorry, which companies or which firms are going to get the capital required to begin their sale, okay, in this planned economy. So now my question is let's say that we have a country full of people that's split on climate change. It's 55-45. So now in this planned economy where the government is choosing who to lend money to, assuming that we have our current population that doesn't believe climate change is real, money is going to continue to be lent to firms or co-ops, I guess I should say, that have workers that are interested and motivated to keep their jobs in existence. So under this system, now what do we do to change people's minds that would be like markedly different than in a capitalist system?
Yeah, so this is the thing. I think this is getting back to something we agreed on earlier, which is that whether we have capitalism or socialism, there's no solution to climate change that doesn't start by convincing a majority of the public that's a problem, right? That's something we agreed on. I think where we disagreed after that was on whether that once you got a majority of the public to take the problem seriously, whether there's more that we could do about under socialism than there is under capitalism, or whether the options would just be equivalent.
Okay, I gotcha. I'll always concede, and I have to, that in a planned economy, you can always address issues like more brutally in a more efficacious manner, right? Because you can literally like say like, hey, like this is how it's going to go, end of discussion. Although I still feel like market-based solutions like things like cap and trade are like really powerful ways that if like markets were financially incentivized to deal with certain problems, that they would do it. They would produce, like if the money was there, I mean, if we all believe that capitalists are greedy evil people, that if the money is there, then they're going to pour the money into it, right? Again, like we saw companies like Tesla flooded really hard on that government credit, right? It's like $8,000 to buy like an electric car or some shit, right? And stuff like that hardcore financially incentivizes different capitalists to invest in things that do help us with climate change, assuming again we have to get over that hurdle that climate change is a problem, because like those government incentives still come from elected officials. So I guess I don't necessarily disagree. Maybe if our disagreement is like whether or not you can address issues using a planned economy over either a mixed market or just like an open or free market or whatever. But man, again, we're getting into like really hardcore. When we talk like having like planned economies, like this is like a pretty hardcore departure from the current like economic status quo in the United States, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'm not. I'm not quite sure at this point.
I understand where our disagreements lie, I think, right? Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Well, you want to leave it there for tonight?
If you want to. If I ever say anything on Twitter that you think is like real dumb or whatever, if you have like a disagreement over some take of mine, you can always like shoot me a message. I stream all the time, so you can always just like hop on and chat with me or whatever. I'm pretty open.
All right. Well, I enjoyed the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for the talk.
Shabbat shalom, my friend.
I don't know, dude.
That was a riveting conversation.
Like every single lefty conversation I have is gonna be like this, right? Like I don't know what to.
the thing is, it's like you ask a question and it's going to go very long, and it seems like you just leave at the same place when you ask the question.
Well,
Why
yeah,
doesn't this
because like
work
we
every-
don't usually disagree on much, and like I guess like here's the problem. Like somebody will say, like, I'll say like, okay, this is like all of my lefty conversations in a nutshell. Okay, I want to know what is the most effective medicine to take for strep throat. Okay, and somebody says, okay, well, the best medicine to take, exercise is really important. It keeps you healthy, keeps your immune system stronger. Sleeping is like really important for you as well. You know, like that makes it so that you have a stronger body. Again, your immune system works better. Having a good diet is really important. You know, making sure that you're getting the proper vitamins. And then like at the end of the conversation, I'm like, okay, but like, I don't know what any of that has to do with like the medicine that I asked for, right? Like we're not talking about medication at all. We're just talking about like other things that aren't at all related to medication. And that's like every lefty debate I have. Like people will be like, oh, well, how does socialism or whatever solve any of these problems? Like, well, we need government incentives. We need to vote, blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, that has nothing to do with socialism. Like all of this can happen under capitalism, right? Like,
Yeah, and also like the flaws of like how do you even get socialism to work to the level they're talking about?
Well, like,
without
but that's
being fucking crushed from other countries.
Yeah,
also.
like, that's the
so
problem,
you need
too.
Every country to do it.
But that's the problem too, is the guy already conceded. He's like, well, in order for this to work, we would need like a global socialist government. And it's like, okay.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like unanswered questions about this as well. So like let's assume that socialism is in place all across the world right now. So does that mean that there's no wealthy people or less wealthy people? Who wants to do the shitty jobs that need to be done that can't be automated? Like who's opting into that job? And like there's so much shit that doesn't make sense under this shit. Especially when it comes to like Veblen goods, like people have a desire to wear like things that make them stand out. How does
Well,
that
I think
directly-
socialists, I think generally try to believe in the elimination of classes, that there shouldn't be like an outer class, an upper class, a middle class.
It seems pretty unlikely that. I mean, people are pretty. If you look at us today, we're pretty fucking tied to the idea of being unique and standing out.
Stop!
Like,
You're making bad capitalist arguments. Don't do this to me. Don't make me defend lefty
But
arguments.
how do you think that that's not the case?
Because they're going to say you've been brainwashed by which you have. You're making brainwashed by capitalism paradigms. We could probably conceive of a world
I
where
disagree.
people.
Fucking animals.
No,
have this
come
in
on.
the
I'm
same
sure
way.
that at some point in human history, we can probably find some society that didn't have the strict delineation of classes that we do today in America. That there has to be an upper class, a lower class. I'm sure there have been times in society where it hasn't necessarily been divided along these same lines.
I'm not
right?
saying that there won't be classes. I'm saying that people have a desire to stand out and be unique from other people. And in a society where you can't have any advantage over anyone.
No, oh my God, stop! Oh my God, Dan, stop!
What? Tell me.
When
Tell
you
me
talk
where I'm
about
wrong.
standing out and being unique and blah blah blah, you're feeding me consumerist capitalist arguments now. You're saying, well, the only way you can stand out and be unique is if you buy shit. That's not true. We could envision a million ways that people could be unique. In a socialist system where people have more free time, maybe the ways they stand out is they pursue different arts or hobbies or crafts. Maybe they do music. Maybe they do painting. Maybe they pursue things that they couldn't pursue under capitalism. You could potentially, theoretically, you could be even more unique under those systems. And if we imagine a world where people don't have to work as much,
I
and
was
everybody.
just testing you to see if you knew that answer. Good. I was a test. I was making sure you were an actual good capitalist who was ready
Okay,
to debate.
just be careful, okay? Because if the more of these dumbass arguments I make, the more dumb fuck lefties I pick up, and I don't fucking want. Sorry, I'm just gonna.
Listen, I was making sure. I was just making sure. I had to. I had to be
Okay.
very serious. I didn't believe any of that, chat. I was testing.
Okay.
Yeah, but the thing he was saying though about what was he saying specifically about the like venture investments or something like that would be better under socialism or something?
Well, what he was saying is he'd basically have he's advocating for like a planned market. So like the government would give preferential loans to what we decide is worth loaning to. So basically we would have a vote. We would say these are the types of businesses we want, and then those types of businesses would receive really good loans from public institutions that would make them that other companies wouldn't.
Right, but we do that now with like a lot of different.
Yeah, we have
things
government
involved,
incentives
stuff going on.
involved. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's like insane things. Like there's this new thing, believe it or not, that Trump created, I believe, called opportunity zones, and it's designed to like
Bolster
it's
investment
a- into like shitty areas, and it's like an insane investment to do it. So if you're in some like dilapidated like shit town in Buffalo or something that's like a Rust Belt place, still like it's like 100% write-off on all capital gains. So if you invest like $100 million into building something and then it's worth $1 billion, like there's no gains at all.
Yeah.
So the government does do shit like that they care about. But yeah. So the question is, what is the argument of how do we get from one country thinking about doing socialist shit to the not getting crushed, which I think that's what Marx says, right?
Yeah,
It's
I
like
already
you can't
answered
survive
this. He said that you have to have like a global socialist government.
all
That's-
at once.
Yeah, and it's like a global socialist government.
Your original argument was one of utility. It seems in that case I'm actually losing utility there by strictly referring to him as a he.